The years between my doctorate and the lecture hall are a story of accumulation so quiet it was practically silent. I published. Then I published again. Then I published 7 more times. My work on cognitive bias and financial decision-making was cited in policy papers. I was invited to speak at conferences in cities I'd only seen on maps. I was offered a visiting lectureship, then a full position, then tenure at an institution whose name I'd once circled in a library book when I was 15. Not because I thought I'd end up there, but because dreaming was free and free was the only price I could afford. Meanwhile, the family narrative continued its orbit around Matthew. His promotion, his apartment in Tribeca, his engagement to a woman named Claire who worked in public relations and understood intuitively the art of managing perception, his photo on the company website, his name in the alumni magazine. Every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, every phone call, the conversation flowed toward Matthew the way water flows toward the lowest point, effortlessly, by gravity, by the accumulated weight of 25 years of reinforcement. Nobody in my family read my papers. Nobody attended my lectures. Nobody Googled my name, which, if they had, would have returned 14 pages of results, academic profiles, conference presentations, an interview with a research journal where I discussed how childhood resource inequality shapes adult identity. The title of that interview was The Invisible Sibling. My mother did not see it. The irony did not require annotation. The executive education program was Matthew's idea, or rather, his company's idea. At 40, he'd plateaued. The VP title that had once sounded like a destination was revealing itself as a ceiling. The firm wanted its senior leaders to sharpen their strategic thinking. They enrolled them in an 8-week program at the university. My university. The program coordinator sent me the participant list in a routine email: 12 names, corporate titles, company affiliations. Name number 7, Matthew Carter, VP of Strategy. I read the name 3 times, not because I doubted it, because I wanted to feel each letter individually, the way you feel each step when you're walking towards something you've been approaching your entire life without knowing the distance. I could have recused myself, cited the conflict of interest, asked a colleague to take the session. That would have been the cautious choice, the practical choice, the Vivian-shaped choice my family had always expected. I didn't make it. I made the other choice, the one that had been building inside me since that hallway with the uneven frames. I would teach the class. I would teach it brilliantly. And I would let my brother discover, in a room full of his peers, that the sister he'd never bothered to see had become someone worth looking at. The first lecture was Cognitive Bias and Strategic Leadership. I opened with a case study about resource allocation, how organizations systematically overinvest in visible projects with charismatic leaders while underfunding quieter initiatives that generate higher long-term returns. The parallel to my family was so precise it could have been a clinical diagnosis, but I delivered it as pure scholarship because that's what it was. My personal history was the seed. The research was the tree, and nobody in that room needed to know the roots to appreciate the branches. Matthew sat in the 3rd row taking notes. After the initial shock of recognition, which lasted approximately 9 seconds, during which his face cycled through surprise, confusion, and something I can only describe as recalculation, he composed himself. He didn't speak to me after the first class, didn't approach the podium, didn't linger. He packed his bag and left with the others, glancing back once at the door. Our eyes met. His expression wasn't hostile. It was something more complex. The look of a man encountering a piece of evidence that contradicts his central thesis. Not anger, vertigo. He approached me after the 3rd class. The other participants had filed out. He walked to the podium slowly, hands in his pockets, the posture of a man who has rehearsed casualness so aggressively it circles back to visible tension. "Why didn't you tell me you were here?" he said. Here meaning the university, here meaning the faculty, here meaning this altitude he hadn't known I could reach. I organized my notes into my folder, the same way I organize everything, deliberately. "You didn't ask. That's not fair, Vivian." "When would I have asked? When have you ever asked me anything about my career?" He opened his mouth, closed it. I continued because the words were already assembled and they'd been waiting longer than either of us. "You've known me for 37 years, Matthew. In that time, you have never once asked what I'm working on, what I've published, what I've built. You've never read anything I've written. You've never attended a single event. You've never Googled my name, which would have taken you 5 seconds and saved us both this conversation. He looked at the whiteboard behind me where my credentials were still written. The doctorate, the university name, the departmental title. I watched him read them the way I'd watched our mother read my dissertation news, as information that didn't fit the existing file and therefore had to be processed rather than celebrated. How long have you been tenured? 4 years. His jaw tightened, not visibly, internally. I could see the muscle at the hinge. And you didn't say anything. At Thanksgiving, at Christmas, you sat there and I sat there and let the conversation be about you. The way it's always been about you. The way Mom and Dad designed it. I wasn't hiding, Matthew. I was invisible. There's a difference. One is a choice. The other is a condition imposed by people who decided what you were allowed to be before you could spell your own name. He stood there for a long time. The lecture hall was empty. The fluorescent lights hummed the way they always hum in institutional rooms. The background frequency of education, of hospitals, of places where difficult truths are delivered under unflattering light. He finally said, I didn't know. And I said, I know you didn't. That's the saddest part. I taught the remaining 5 weeks without incident. Matthew attended every session. He participated thoughtfully, asked good questions, submitted his assignments on time. He was, as I'd always known, genuinely intelligent. The difference between us was never capacity. It was conditions. He'd been given a greenhouse. I'd been given a sidewalk crack. We both grew, but only one of us was supposed to. After the final class, he lingered again. This time he brought something, a copy of my dissertation, tabbed with colored sticky notes, dog-eared at the corners the way books get when someone has actually read them rather than displayed them. I read it, he said, all of it. He paused. His voice was different, softer, stripped of the boardroom polish that usually coated every word. The section on differential parental investment, the data about how underfunded siblings develop higher autonomy but lower baseline trust. He looked at me. You were writing about us. I was writing about a pattern that affects millions of families. We happen to be one of them. He set the dissertation on the podium between us. It's the best thing I've ever read, and I'm not saying that as your brother. I'm saying it as someone who just spent 300 pages understanding for the first time what it was like to grow up in the same house as me. He cleared his throat. The mechanical male gesture of emotional management I'd seen in my father 1,000 times. I'm sorry, Vivian. Not for Harvard. I didn't choose that. But for not seeing you. For not asking. For sitting at every family table for 20 years and never once wondering why you were so quiet. I didn't realize until page 214 that your quiet wasn't personality. It was policy, enforced by all of us, including me. Page 214, he'd counted, the way I once counted the frames in the hallway. And in that moment, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not vindication, not triumph, recognition. The thing I'd been building toward my entire life without realizing it. Not the recognition of an audience or an institution or a tenure committee. The recognition of being seen by someone who'd been in the room all along but facing the other direction. He saw me, late, imperfectly, with the clumsy, blinking disorientation of someone who has just walked out of a very long movie and is adjusting to the actual light. But he saw me, and I let him. Mom called me 2 weeks after the program ended. Matthew had told her everything. The lecture hall, the dissertation, the tenure, the published papers. The university that had invited me to teach the program her golden child had enrolled in. She was quiet for the first 30 seconds of the call. A novel experience for both of us. Vivian, I owe you an apology that I don't know how to make. I'm listening, Mom. We got it wrong. Your father and I. We looked at Matthew and saw someone who needed everything we had. We looked at you and saw someone who didn't need anything. And we were so wrong, because what we were actually seeing was a child who needed us just as much but had already figured out that needing us was pointless. So she stopped asking, and we let her. I held the phone against my ear in the house I'd bought with my own money, in the office lined with books I'd written and books that had shaped me, in the life I'd constructed from the raw materials of being overlooked. And I let my mother's words find the place they belonged, not in the wound. The wound was already closed. In the record. The record I'd been keeping since I was 15 years old, counting frames in a hallway, measuring the distance between what was given and what was withheld. Thank you, Mom. She was crying. I could hear it in the consonants. What can I do? You can start by reading page 214. She laughed through the tears. A small, wet, broken sound. The most honest sound she'd ever made in my presence. I'll read every page. I know you will. You're practical like that. She laughed again. So did I, and for the first time in 37 years, we were laughing at the same thing. I am not telling you this story to punish my parents or humiliate my brother. I'm telling it because the pattern I lived inside is so common it's practically invisible, and invisible patterns are the most dangerous kind because the people trapped in them don't know they're trapped. They think it's just how things are. Matthew isn't a villain. He's a man who was placed at the center of a family's hopes and never asked to share the spotlight because no one told him there was another performer on the stage. He's learning now, slowly, the way all of us learn the things we should have known all along, with discomfort and delay and the humbling recognition that our ignorance had a cost someone else paid. Mom and Dad aren't monsters. They're people who made a bet on one child with the confidence of gamblers who don't realize they're playing with someone else's chips. They loved us both. I believe that completely. But love without equity is just preference wearing a better outfit. And I spent 2 decades being loved in theory while being overlooked in practice. And me, I'm the woman who turned practical into a profession, who turned resourceful into revenue, who turned the family's lowest expectations into the highest standard of work I could produce. I didn't become Matthew's professor to prove a point. I became his professor because I was the most qualified person for the job. The fact that it proved a point was just the compound interest on a lifetime of being underestimated. So here is my question for you, and I mean it. If the people who raised you poured everything into someone else and left you to figure it out on your own, what did you build with the nothing they gave you? Tell me in the comments. I want to hear what you made from what you were not given. Because I've learned that the most extraordinary things in this world are not built by people who had everything. They're built by people who were told they didn't deserve anything and decided, quietly, relentlessly, without applause, to prove the allocation wrong. If this story stayed with you, subscribe. There is another story linked below about someone whose family discovered that the child they dismissed became the person they couldn't ignore. I think it will hit close to home. I'll see you there. He didn't recognize me at first. I want you to sit with that for a moment. My own brother walked into a lecture hall at one of the most prestigious universities on the planet, sat in the 3rd row, opened a notebook he'd probably bought that morning, looked directly at the woman standing behind the podium, and did not realize he was looking at his sister. Not because we hadn't seen each other in decades. We'd been at the same Thanksgiving table 11 months earlier. Not because I'd changed my appearance. Same face, same glasses, same posture I've carried since I was 14. The slight forward lean of someone who learned early that you have to move toward things because nothing in this life comes toward you. He didn't recognize me because he had never learned to see me. You can't recognize someone you've never actually looked at. I stood at the podium, 37 years old, tenured faculty, published in 9 peer-reviewed journals, invited to lecture at the institution my parents had paid $250,000 to educate their son. And their son was sitting 12 feet away from me, staring at his phone, waiting for class to begin, with no idea that the professor about to teach him advanced behavioral economics was the girl who used to do his math homework at the kitchen table while their mother made dinner for one child and a future for another. I didn't say anything. Not yet. I let him settle into his seat, watched him glance at the syllabus printout on the desk, scanned the room with the casual confidence of a man who'd been told since birth that every room he entered was lucky to have him. Then I picked up the dry erase marker, turned to the whiteboard, and wrote my name in capital letters. Dr. Vivian Carter. I heard the rustling stop, heard the specific quality of silence that occurs when a brain collides with something it cannot immediately process. I turned around. He was staring at me, mouth slightly open, phone frozen in his hand. Not the blank stare of someone confused by a stranger. The fixed, unblinking stare of someone watching a magic trick and trying to locate the mechanism. The trick, of course, was that there was no trick. Just a woman who'd spent 20 years becoming someone her family said she'd never be, standing in the exact building her family had paid for someone else to attend. Vivian? He said it like a question, like maybe there was another explanation, like maybe his sister had a doppelganger who happened to hold a doctorate in the same field and teach at the same university during the same semester his executive education program happened to meet. I smiled, the kind of smile that arrives when something you've imagined 1,000 times finally becomes real and turns out to be quieter than you expected. Good morning. Welcome to Behavioral Economics and Organizational Strategy. I'm Dr. Carter. I'll be your instructor for the next 8 weeks. Then I opened my lecture notes and began teaching as if the third row were empty. Because for 37 years, to my family, it had been, if this story already feels like yours, if you've ever been the sibling who was skipped over, underfunded, or invisible, subscribe right now. Drop your city and the time where you are in the comments. I want to know who's listening and I want to know where. My name is Vivian. I'm 37. And this is the story of how my parents invested everything in my brother's future at Harvard while telling me my dreams were too expensive, how he coasted on credentials while I built expertise from nothing, and how 2 decades later I ended up standing at the front of his classroom, holding the knowledge he'd paid to receive but I'd earned for free. But to understand the lecture hall, you need to understand the hallway. 1994. Our house in Newton, Massachusetts. A colonial with dark green shutters and a hallway that connected the kitchen to the living room. And in that hallway hung a gallery wall. Every family has one. Ours told a story, just not the one my parents intended. The frames started with baby photos, both of us, Matthew and me, equally represented in the soft focus, drool-covered democracy of infancy. But as the wall progressed chronologically, a pattern emerged so gradually that you'd only see it if you stepped back and looked at the whole thing at once, the way you'd read a graph rather than a single data point. Matthew's frames multiplied. His Little League team, his science fair trophy, his 8th grade graduation where he wore a tie and our father beamed in every shot. My frames thinned. A school portrait here, a blurry snapshot from a family vacation there. By the time the wall reached high school, the ratio was roughly 7-1. 7 of Matthew for every one of me. I counted them once. Stood in that hallway when everyone else was asleep and counted them the way a scientist counts specimens, not with emotion but with precision. Because even at 15 I understood that precision was more useful than tears. Tears ask for comfort. Numbers ask for nothing. They just sit there, irrefutable, waiting for someone honest enough to read them. My parents were not bad people. I need to say that before I say everything else, because the story only works if you understand that the cruelty was not intentional. It was architectural. It was built into the design of how they saw their children, and like most architecture, it was invisible to the people who lived inside it. My father, Richard Carter, was a tax attorney with a firm in Boston. Meticulous, principled, deeply committed to the idea that education was the single most important investment a family could make. My mother, Diane, was a school administrator who had given up a potential career in academic research to raise us, a sacrifice she mentioned often enough that it became less a fact and more a climate. Something always present, slightly overcast, influencing every decision without being directly named. Together they believed 2 things with the conviction of people who had never examined their assumptions. 1. Matthew was brilliant. 2. Vivian was practical. Those 2 words, brilliant and practical, seem almost complementary until you watch how a family distributes resources based on them. Brilliant gets investment. Practical gets expectations. Brilliant gets a future built by other people's money. Practical gets told you'll figure it out, which is the family equivalent of an unfunded mandate. Matthew is not stupid. I want to be clear about that too because this isn't a story about a dumb sibling and a smart one. It's more complicated and more painful than that. Matthew was genuinely intelligent, charming, social in a way that made rooms rearrange themselves around him. He had the kind of confidence that comes from never having been allowed to fail, the psychological equivalent of always playing with a net. He got good grades because the family infrastructure was designed to produce them. Tutors. When he struggled, sat prep courses that cost $1,000. A college counselor hired specifically to optimize his application. The machine worked. Matthew got into Harvard. The night the acceptance letter arrived, my mother cried at the kitchen table. My father opened a bottle of wine he'd been saving. They called both sets of grandparents. They called the neighbors. They posted the letter on the refrigerator, where it stayed for 3 years, yellowing slightly at the edges, a monument to the family's highest achievement. The tuition was $52,000 a year, with room, board, books, and the lifestyle my parents considered appropriate for a Harvard student. The annual cost was closer to $68,000. Over 4 years, they spent approximately $270,000 on Matthew's education. They took out loans. They refinanced the house. My father worked weekends. My mother picked up consulting work. Every dollar was a brick in the cathedral of Matthew's potential, I was 15 when Matthew left for Cambridge. Sophomore year. I had a 4.1 GPA, which was higher than Matthew's had been at the same age, but nobody made that comparison because comparisons only flowed in one direction in our house. I was taking AP classes in math and economics. I'd started reading behavioral psychology textbooks from the public library, not for school, but because something about the intersection of human behavior and decision-making lit up a part of my brain that homework never reached. I told my mother I wanted to study economics, maybe get a PhD someday. She was folding laundry. She didn't look up. That's a long road, Vivian. Very competitive, very expensive. I know, but if I get strong enough grades I could get scholarships and well, she said, let's focus on getting Matthew settled first. Then we'll see. Let's focus on Matthew first. As if there were a queue. As if my ambitions were standing in line behind his, holding a ticket, waiting to be called. The number on my ticket never came. When my turn arrived, the conversation was 19 minutes long. I remember because I watched the microwave clock over my mother's shoulder. I'd been accepted to 3 universities. 2 offered partial scholarships. The best program for economics was at a state school 4 hours away. Total cost with scholarships roughly $14,000 a year. A fraction of Matthew's Harvard. A rounding error in the family's educational budget. Dad sat across from me. Mom stood by the counter. Their faces were matching expressions of sympathetic regret, rehearsed to match, like they'd discussed this in bed the night before and agreed on a tone. Vivian, we're proud of you. But the financial reality is that Matthew's loans have stretched us to the limit. We just don't have the capacity to take on more debt right now. I looked at the spreadsheet I'd prepared. Yes, I'd prepared a spreadsheet, because that's what practical daughters do. They come with data. They make it easy to say yes, and it still isn't enough. 14,000 is very manageable if we. Dad shook his head. Not right now, sweetheart. The thing is, you're practical. You're resourceful. You'll find a way to make it work. There it was again. The word, practical, deployed like a lock on a door I was trying to open. They'd found $270,000 for Matthew's potential. They couldn't find $14,000 for mine. And the difference wasn't financial. The money was gone, yes, but it was gone because they'd chosen to spend it. Every dollar that went to Matthew was a dollar they decided he deserved more than I did. The scarcity wasn't an accident. It was a consequence of a choice they'd made years earlier, the choice to see one child as an investment and the other as an expense. I found a way. I always found a way. Federal loans, 2 campus jobs, a research assistantship that paid $800 a month and taught me more than any class ever would. I graduated in 3.5 years because I took extra credits every semester to save on tuition. I lived in a room the size of a walk-in closet with a window that faced a parking garage. I ate dining hall food so strategically that I could make one meal plan stretch to cover 4 meals if I timed it right. I read everything, not just the assigned texts but the papers they referenced, and the papers those papers referenced, descending into the literature like a diver going deeper because the surface had nothing left to offer me. My professors noticed the way professors notice quiet students who produce exceptional work, not with fanfare, with opportunities, a seat in a graduate seminar, a recommendation for a research fellowship, an invitation to co-author a paper that would become my first publication. Each opportunity was a rung on a ladder I was building myself, in the dark, while my family watched Matthew climb a staircase someone else had built for him in broad daylight. If you've ever built something extraordinary with no resources, no support, and no recognition, and then watch someone else get celebrated for doing the same thing with every advantage, I need you to tell me about it below. Not because I want you to relive the pain, because I want you to see it clearly. What you did was harder, and harder, in the long run. Build something that can't be bought. Matthew graduated from Harvard with a degree in business and the gravitational certainty of someone who has been told he's exceptional so many times that he genuinely cannot conceive of an alternative. He got a job at a consulting firm. Good salary, nice title. He moved to New York. He wore suits that cost more than my monthly rent and talked about markets and leadership and disruption with the fluency of someone who'd memorized the vocabulary but never stayed long enough with any idea to discover its anatomy. He was successful the way a well-lit storefront is successful. Visible, attractive, ultimately dependent on inventory. Someone else stocked. I went to graduate school. Full scholarship, earned, not given. A doctoral program in behavioral economics at a university that saw in my application what my parents never had, not just competence, but original thinking, the kind that comes from spending your whole life observing systems from the outside because nobody invited you in. My dissertation took for years. It examined how family resource allocation patterns influence long-term achievement motivation in siblings. I'll let you sit with the irony of that. I studied, scientifically, the exact phenomenon I'd lived. I quantified the wound. I peer-reviewed my own childhood. And when I defended it, when 3 professors and an external examiner told me it was one of the most rigorous pieces of work they'd seen in a decade, I called my mother from the hallway outside the defense room. She picked up on the 4th ring. "Hi, honey, what's going on?" "I defended my dissertation today. I passed. I'm going to be Dr. Carter." Pause. "Oh, that's wonderful, Vivian. Good for you." She said it the way you'd respond to a coworker announcing they'd organized their desk. Pleasant, detached, proportionally inappropriate to the event being described. Then, without a breath, she said, "Your brother just got promoted. He's the youngest VP in his division. Isn't that something?" I stood in that hallway, phone pressed to my ear, wearing the same blazer I'd worn to every academic event for 3 years because I only owned one, and I listened to my mother redirect my doctorate into a footnote beneath my brother's job title. "Isn't that something?" "Yes, Mom, that's something." I hung up, walked to my car, sat in the driver's seat, and cried. Not long, maybe for minutes. Then I started the engine and drove to the library because I had a paper to revise, and revised papers don't care whether your mother is proud of you or not.